Hi, it's Kelly Vandever. Just a quick note before we get started with our interview with Jay Goldman. Jay was especially generous with his time, and he provided some great content. But because it was a long interview, almost an hour and a half, I decided to break it up into two parts. So this is part one, and I'm sure after you're done listening to what Jay has to say, you'll be eager to listen to part two. This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Kelly Vandever, and my special guest today is Jay Goldman. Jay is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, The Decoded Company, Know Your Talent Better Than You Know Your Customers. The book reveals how industry-leading companies are decoding employee work data to personalize, simplify, and enhance the employee experience. Jay is the co-founder and managing director of Sensei Labs, where he and his team help organizations reinvent the technology of management, applying the principles in the Decoded Company using Sensei OS, the enterprise operating system for hyper-growth companies. Jay is a technologist, designer, speaker, and a generally swell guy, and we're delighted to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to start our podcast, as we always do, getting to know you a little as a person first. So my first quirky question for you is, what is your secret guilty pleasure television show?
So I became a bit obsessed with Westworld. I think, like much of the rest of the world, became a bit obsessed with it. I had actually seen the old 70s movie with Yul Brynner, and it was not necessarily a good movie, but I had seen it back in the day. And so when I saw that they were making a remake, I was a bit tentative on whether this was going to be good, but it's actually an amazing show. And it's got some pretty thought-provoking pieces in it about humanity and all that kind of stuff. So I was watching that. I'm not sure that qualifies as guilty pleasure, but I was pretty obsessed with that while it was in the first season. So I was really glad to hear that it's been renewed. I think maybe a little bit more on the guilty pleasure side, the Silicon Valley series from HBO. Is it on HBO? I think it's at Westworld's on HBO. But Silicon Valley, it's such a pointed takedown of the bad parts of the Silicon Valley culture. And I think if you spent any time in the tech industry, particularly around venture-backed startup sort of part of the world, Silicon Valley is just, it's so on the nose that, I would say that's probably my guilty pleasure.
Very cool, very cool. Now, you're the second person who has said Westworld, so and I'm not familiar with it, so I must check it out, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite an amazing cast. Anthony Hopkins, probably the most well-known player among them, but it's a pretty amazing cast, and the effects are so well done. It's a very big budget show, so they spend a lot of money per episode. But you can watch it as sort of the surface level is just entertainment, but it actually really provokes some thoughts around what it means to be human or not human, or where sort of the future is going with artificial intelligence. Yeah, I would highly recommend.
Very cool. And I hadn't heard of the Silicon Valley one either, so.
They're in they just finished season 3. I think season 4 starts in April. And it's the life of a fictional startup called Pied Piper as it kind of journeys through creation and funding and all of the things that can go wrong. And I think for people who haven't spent time around the Valley and the tech world, it's probably a much less good show. But if you have spent time around it and you know some of the players, because a lot of the actual players in the Silicon Valley world make guest appearances in the show. So that part's kind of fun, but they also have created characters, and it's always fun to figure out who they're lampooning in the character that they've created. I would recommend that as well if you're into that world.
Very cool, very cool. Well, I'd like to watch a lot of television, so I'll have to try those out. So my second quirky question for you is, what is your favorite possession?
So think that's a tough question to answer, actually. I certainly put less value on possessions in my life than I do on the time that I get to spend with people and that sort of thing. I have a 7-year-old daughter who I love spending time with. So, that certainly takes precedent over any of the possessions that I have. But the item that comes to mind immediately, because it reminds me of some really fun travels that I've had the opportunity to do with very good friends, who I also am very fortunate to consider colleagues at Klick. But I have a camera that is actually a Russian knockoff of a Leica camera from the 1950s that I bought in a flea market in Mongolia. And that just has so much story to it, and such a reminder of the place and where I was standing when I bought it. And so that was actually the first thing that came to mind.
Now, can you actually still take pictures with this camera?
No, it's actually, oddly enough, it's jammed closed, and nobody's managed to get it open yet. So the question is whether there is some unexposed or exposed film inside the camera from some point in history that might be really interesting, but it's absolutely jammed closed, and at risk of breaking it to get it open, I haven't actually managed to pry it open yet. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my
so if
gosh.
any of your listeners have suggestions on how to open 1950s era Russian Leica knockoff cameras, I would love to hear them.
Oh, I'm dying to know what's in there. Very cool. Very cool. Are you okay? There, I lost you for a moment, so I just wanted to pause. We'll do a little slicing there too. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, now let's transition into some more serious content, and I'd like to know what your story is. What happened in your life that got you to a place where you cared about changing the way we approach business and management?
I think I've had some pretty amazing opportunities. I started my career at IBM, and so I got to experience being part of a very, very large company very early in my career. And so I came to understand, especially an older company like IBM that's been around for a long time and has very established management practices that really emerged at a time where data was very expensive. So they tend towards the one-size-fits-all model because accommodating individuals is actually very difficult when data is hard to come by. And so you end up with things like, and there's an example of this in the book, but you end up with things like when I started my career at IBM in 1999, and this may still be true, I don't know, but you got promoted on your 1-year anniversary for the first few years of your time at IBM, not based on merit or your individual accomplishments, but because there were so many people that it was just easier to say that at that level in the company, you probably hadn't contributed that much value, so you should just get promoted every 12 months. And to me, that's the exact opposite of how you should be running your team and how you should be investing in your talent. And really, anytime that you're optimizing for the masses, a one-size-fits-all policy, you've effectively said the most important members of our team are the middle of the bell curve because you're optimizing for the people who are kind of average. And so what you're saying is the people who are less good than them should just get promoted with them anyway. So they're being unfairly promoted. And the really great people, the sort of rock stars, to use the maybe Silicon Valley term for it, but they should get promoted at a rate slower than their actual accomplishments. If you're thinking about where to make investments in your talent pool, you should skew that curve all the way to the right side. The only people you should actually care about are your rock stars, and everybody else should come along at a rate that's relative to the performance of your top performers. So anytime you've created a policy that says we're going to reward the performance of the middle of our curve and not the top of the curve makes no sense, especially if you're in the top of the curve. And so for me, that was a very early experience in, okay, I don't necessarily know what the right answer is, but I know it's not this. And so I left for a very small startup, had the opposite sort of experience. That startup had layoffs very early after I joined, and unfortunately, I was one of a member of the third of the company that got cut. So excuse me. So I had, maybe 6 months time at that startup, and that was enough time to experience a bit of the opposite end. And I think over my career, I've had the opportunity to have really strong managers who really helped me and coached me and helped to develop me. I've had really terrible managers that did exactly the opposite. And so that's given me a perspective on both sides of that. And actually, one of the interesting things, I talk about this a lot with my colleagues in becoming a parent, is realizing that the way that you parent is very similar to the way that you manage. And so if you had good parents who were, everybody finds ways to mess up parenting, but if your parents found minor ways to mess up parenting and also did really good things, you're probably a pretty good parent yourself. Likewise, if you had good managers and bad managers, you have that mix of knowledge about how to do that. And so I've had the good fortune of having good parents and also, and I think they did a great job. There were things that they did that I was conscious of not repeating with my daughter. And I think I had great managers and bad managers. And so I took from both and sort of figured out how to do a good job of leading a team. But that's actually quite rare. Most people, when they get to a leadership position, have no formal training in how to do leadership and management. We sort of expect that they've spent time in the workforce, they should know this, or they're really good at their craft, and somehow that translates to them being a good leader. And so we don't prepare them for that. So Klick, the parent company of Sensei Labs, is nearly 700 people now. And we realized about a year ago that we had about 175 managers in our organization who had people reporting to them. And we had never done anything to say, this is how you should be a manager in our organization. This is the expectation we have of our leaders. This is how you should be spending your time. And so we went back and started to formalize the craft of leadership within our organization. And as we did that, we realized that that's actually a very rare thing to do. There are not many organizations that invest in the craft of leadership. They might invest in the craft of the things that their people do. If you're in an agency model like Klick sort of is, you might invest in the craft of your creative team or your web development team or whatever, but you don't actually invest in the craft of leadership. And if you think about the leverage that the investment in leadership as a craft has in the success of the organization, it's actually far greater than the investment in the individual crafts. So all of that is sort of the journey that brought me to where I got to when we started writing Decoded, which was, Decoded was really written for two reasons. A purely selfish reason, which was we had been asked so many times about Klick and how we had built the culture and how we continued to grow at the rate of 40% year over year. Klick's 20th anniversary this year, we've grown 40% year over year on average for 20 years, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. And I can only take a very small amount of the credit for doing that. I joined 6 years ago. So Liram and Aaron and Peter Cordy, our three co-founders, had done an incredible job for 14 years before I got here in building the foundation for that growth. Lots of people asked us about that. So we had clients ask us, why, when we compare you guys to our other agencies, are you so much more efficient and on the ball and make fewer mistakes? And we had people ask us, leaders of other companies, how have you guys built this amazing culture and this growth engine and all of that sort of thing? And so there were two reasons for writing Decoded. One was to answer that question. There were people asking us, so we thought it was a good time to tell our story. We didn't want this to just be the story of Klick, though. So there's lots of research in the book, and I think, Kelly, you read the book, so right. You've come across some of that research about other companies that are doing similar things. So that was the one reason that we did it. The other more selfish reason was we wanted this to be a book that people read and then said, I have to work for this company. And so we wrote it as a recruiting tool to get out there. And that was, I'd say, minorly successful. It was less successful than we hoped it would be. We certainly have some members of the team who read the book and then immediately applied and came to work here. So that's been rewarding, but maybe not at the scale we thought it was. The thing we didn't anticipate was that every time, we certainly didn't anticipate becoming a New York Times bestseller, which was a fantastic experience. And as a result of that, we got invited on this great speaking tour where people wanted us to come and talk about Decoded. The piece we really didn't anticipate was every time we came off stage, there was a lineup of people who wanted to buy the software. They said, this is amazing. I want this for my organization. And so our answer at first was, well, you really can't have it. It's a custom piece of software that we wrote for ourselves. It wouldn't work in other organizations. And then after a few of these speaking tour stops, Liram and I looked at each other and said, maybe we should figure out how to sell this to people, because apparently they really want to buy it. Right. And so that set off the journey of Sensei Labs to figure out how to take this thing that we had built internally and turn it into something that could work for other organizations, how to generalize it so it wasn't as tightly bound to Klick's business, infrastructure questions about how to deploy this in a reliable way for other people. And so that really that became the journey of Sensei Labs that brought us to where we are today.
Very cool, very cool. Well, and what I thought was really fascinating about there's a lot fascinating about the book, but what I found it very different in a lot of material that's written about employee engagement and building great cultures and stuff was so much of an emphasis on the data. So how did that develop, the culture and the data? How did they intertwine with Klick and create that story?
Sure, that's a great question. So if you trace back 20 years in Klick's history, 1997, Liram was 17 and Aaron was 18, I think. Peter Cordy, the third co-founder, was always the adult supervision. So, so I don't think he'd mind me saying that. But they were very young. And they had actually been working with Peter at that point for about 5 or 6 years. So from their early teens, the actual origin of story of Klick, which I love telling because it's such a great story. It's not very long, but it's a great story. Liram and Aaron were always looking for ways to make some money on the side. So they had a bunch of different businesses. One of Lee's early experiences in this was, making money mowing people's lawns, and then figuring out that he actually much preferred getting his friends to mow the lawns and paying them and then running the business. So he at some point had, 15, 20 friends mowing lawns and shoveling driveways and then acting as the sort of coordinator of all of this. One of the early attempts that they had at making money, they were installing AV systems. So people would buy a high-end home theater, and this was back in the 90s, so that was a lot less simple than it was today. And so Lee and Aaron would show up, and they would do all the wiring and stuff. So one day they're crawling around in the ceiling of a neighbor's house installing some speakers. And Peter Cordy was actually friends with this neighbor and happened to have come over, and they were having a coffee. And Peter was lamenting that his agency that he owned at the time had a client which was a radio station, and they were trying to put their top 40 charts for the last 50 years online. But his team, who he had for building websites, couldn't figure out how to do this. And so these two very dusty teenagers emerge from the ceiling, and they say, oh, well, we can do that. Typical bravado of 13-year-olds. And Peter laughs at them. And I think this was a Thursday or Friday. And he says, okay, well, come to the office on Monday and show me what you can do. So they jump on their bikes and they ride down to a bookstore. And this was, way before you could just Google this stuff and find it online. They went down to a bookstore in Toronto called the world's biggest bookstore. And they grabbed every book they could find on building websites and database systems. They couldn't afford to buy them. So they sat in the bookstore and read. And then they coded the entire weekend. And on Monday morning, they biked down to Peter's office, skipped school, and biked down to Peter's office and demoed a working system with top 40 charts on the web. And Peter promptly fired his entire web team, hired Lee and Aaron part-time around school because they were, clearly still in school. And that was really the birth of Klick. And over the next few years, Peter sold that agency, and the company that he sold it to got acquired, and that company got acquired. And this was really in the dot-com boom in the late 90s. And they ended up at a Canadian company called MotionWorks. And at 16, Lee was the CTO of a publicly traded company, and Aaron and Peter were there as well. And MotionWorks was a bit of a disaster. They were actually, as it turned out, became one of the biggest dot-com busts in Canadian side of the dot-com boom. And part of that was really that they had a culture that was actively hostile to its people. So they really managed to the next press release externally. They cared only about the stock valuation and how to continue to boost it up. And they believed that they were running an entertainment company that partnered with entertainment companies to build web properties for them, or with flashy dot-com era startups to build properties for them. And the reality was they lost money on all of that work. And the part of the work that actually made money was the healthcare side. And so Lee, Aaron, and Peter kept pointing that out. We should focus more on health because that's actually what's driving our economic performance. But it wasn't considered sexy enough by the leadership of the company. And they really just got to a point where, as Liram says, we got to this crossroads where we realized that we could either stay and keep the money or leave and have our sanity. And we chose to leave with our sanity. And so in 1997, they left and they founded Klick, with a focus on health because they knew that that was the economic engine behind MotionWorks. And Liram was actually 17 when they founded it. So he had to get his dad to sign the incorporation papers because he wasn't legally of age to be able to sign it. And that was 20 years ago. And now we're nearly 700 people and spread out across North America with some global presence as well. And the vast majority of our work remains health to this day. We are a life science company commercialization partner for the most part, outside of Sensei Labs and the work that my team does. And so it's such a great story because that experience that they had at MotionWorks really shaped the beginning of Klick's culture. We were founded as a direct response to the environment that they had created, not that Liram and Aaron and Peter had created, but that the MotionWorks leadership had created. We were a direct response to that as to how to learn from what not to do, as we were talking about earlier with parenting and with managing, and how to create a culture that people are deeply engaged in and invested in and want to be part of. And that's really where the beginning of Klick was. So to answer the question about the data side, we were born as a technology company. We started off life building technology projects, and we only matured into marketing sometime after that point, probably about 10 years ago, or a little over that, maybe sort of 15 years ago, really began to do the marketing side of things. And to this day, we remain a technology company at heart. Although we are externally an agency for the most part of what we do, we think of ourselves much more like a tech startup, and we behave much more like a tech startup. And certainly Sensei Labs is a tech startup, so parts of our business actually are much more similar to that. But really that core of just taking that attitude of, sure, we can build a system that connects top 40 charts to the web, and then going to figure out how to do it. That sort of idea of taking nothing for granted as the established way of doing things, and always going back to first principles about how we approach everything that we do, is mirrored not only in the work that we do for our clients, but also how we build the company itself, how we build the culture. We're constantly in experimentation mode. We think of ourselves as a startup, even though we're 20 years old. There's no sacred cow here that we won't immediately sacrifice for the purpose of continuing to grow the business. Whether that's how we approach our structure, whether it's how we approach cultural questions, or whether it's how we approach building something like Genome. And so when it came, the sort of genome part of that story, excuse me, apologize for the cough in your listeners' ears. The genome part of the story really starts a few years into Klick's life, about the time that Klick achieved about 50 people as headcount. And Aaron, as COO, looked at this and realized that as the company was growing and there were now people in 2 rooms instead of in 1 room, the people in the second room were now emailing all the people in the first room. And there were attending meetings that they didn't need to be in because they felt this need to stay up to date on what was going on. And so he looked at this and he thought, this inefficiency that's just been created by crossing this 50-person threshold is only going to get worse as we continue to get bigger. And so we have to do something drastic about it now. And so he took the somewhat unprecedented step, I think to this day in most organizations, even though this was about 17 years ago, of banning email. So we can't use email internally because it's incredibly inefficient. Every time you send an email out to a group of people and ask them to do something, everybody else thinks that somebody else is going to do it, so nobody actually does it. Or you end up with these giant CC threads. Half the time people are just sort of worried about covering their ass, so they're CCing people in who don't need to be in the thread. Or you get CC'd in the middle of a thread, and now you have no idea whether you actually care about this or not, and you have to go all the way to the bottom of this giant email, and you have to read all the way up from the bottom, and then you realize that everybody is talking about an attachment that was 3 emails ago in the thread, but you don't have it. So now you have to go hunt down the attachment. All of these things make email actually a terrible collaboration tool. It's not a bad communication tool, but it's a terrible collaboration tool. And it's also the way that most people still to this day manage their priority list. Right. They leave things marked unread in their inbox, or they flag them, or you see newer tools like Google Inbox or some of the other tools that have coming up with coping mechanisms for the fact that you're trying to manage your inbox in as a to-do list. So they do things like, I'm going to snooze this email for 3 days, which is really saying this is a task I need to do, but I can't start on it for 3 days. And so instead of putting it into some task-based system, you're confusing your communication tool with your collaboration tool with your task list. And that's actually a recipe for disaster. And we've all felt that in organizations where we're managing our lives that way. So Aaron took this step 17 years ago, and he said, we're just going to take this ticketing system, which was really just a sort of customer service support ticketing system. And they put it in place. At the beginning, it was an off-the-shelf system, and said, we're just going to use this. So anytime we have a request for our production teams from our client service teams, it has to go through this new ticketing system. And then he took a very Klick approach to change management, which we still do to this day. We call it burning the boats, which is all about, the old expression that if you want to prevent a mutiny on board, burn all the escape boats because there's no way off now and everybody's committed. And so he just told the production teams, don't do any work if it comes to you by email. You have my permission to just ignore the emails. And so they started ignoring the emails, which meant that the client-facing teams very quickly learned to adapt to sending things in tickets. And that was really the beginning of Genome. Now, the data piece comes into play because a short time after that, Liram and Aaron looked at this and realized the data about those tasks is actually in many ways more interesting than the tasks themselves. If you step back and take a macro look, you can actually watch the work flowing through the organization. You can see where it's getting held up. You can see when people have challenges. One of the earliest pieces of automated business logic they built into the system which we talk about in the Decoded Company, is this concept of what was at the time called ticket tennis. Tickets have now evolved into tasks, so we call it task tennis now. But it's this idea that, let's say, Kelly, you and I are working on something together, and that task is bouncing back and forth between us. That might not be a problem. We might just be collaborating. But more often than not, past a certain number of bounces, it's actually indicative of a problem. The system's not smart enough yet to know what the problem might be, but it knows that work is getting held up between you and me. It could be that we're collaborating, but it could also be that the requirements for the ask were not all that clear to start off with, and so we're spending tons of time just clarifying. Or frankly, it could be that I'm being a jerk and I'm just sending it back to you and passing the buck. And so one of the earliest ways that they started to apply data to optimizing the organization's performance was just to flag those to the project manager working on that project and say, I don't know what's wrong with this task, but you should look at it. And so that's one of the sort of examples, the earliest examples, there's lots now, of predictive intelligence in the platform to be able to spot problems before they become problems. And so that's really where this obsession with data comes from, was the realization really early in the life of this that data could become predictive. It could watch our blind spots. It could make us more effective as an organization. It could engage our people more deeply because they weren't fighting fires all the time. And so that started with tasks, but then they realized that the more data that the system has, the better it gets at doing this. And so they started building new things into the system. Well, if it can manage tasks, it can probably manage travel, and it can manage expenses, and then it can manage learning, and it can manage performance, and it can be our social platform. And so today, SenseiOS is what we call an enterprise operating system. It really runs everything that we do, and now that our clients do who are on the SenseiOS platform, with all that data living in the same place. At what we now call the Sensei wisdom layer, because that wisdom about what's happening in the organization is impossible to achieve with point solutions that don't put all their data into the same system. The idea that you can automatically enroll somebody into some learning opportunity in Academy, which is our learning management system, delivered at exactly the right time, so a training intervention or a teachable moment, as we call it in Decoded, because you know their history of projects they've worked on, you know how they were hired and what they'd worked on in the past, you know the people they've collaborated with, you know how engaged they are in the organization, and you can tailor an automatically delivered training moment directly to them. Because of that is impossible without the value of all this data that exists across the platform.
So can you give an example of such a training intervention just to help people visualize what this is like?
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the best ways to think about this is if you think about hiring. Klick does a tremendous amount of hiring. We grow 40% a year in headcount. So this year we hired about 250 people. Next year it'll probably be closer to 350, 400. And we are incredibly, incredibly picky about who we hire into the organization. So to give you a sense of that, Harvard lets in about 8% of their applicants every year. We hire less than 1% of the applicants to roles at Klick.
Wow.
So it's actually harder to get a job here than it is to get into Harvard. And it is critical to us that we don't sacrifice that standard as we grow. Most organizations in their early days can adhere to a standard like that because it's actually easy. You're not growing that fast. Even if you're growing 200% a year, you went from 2 people to 4 people. So it's easy to be picky about those next 2 people, right? And even from 50 people, hiring another 25, yes, it's significant growth to your organization, but 25 people is actually relatively easy to hire. When you start hiring hundreds at a time, so we have many weeks now at Klick where there's 10 new people starting. So you have to get very systematic about this. And in order to keep that standard, we look at thousands of applicants often for a position. We interviewed, I don't know the exact number, but it's somewhere around, or we not interviewed, but we looked at the beginning of our hiring funnel, something like 60,000 applicants to get down to 250 jobs. So it's actually a pretty intense funnel. Now, we look at the world from a funnel perspective because much of our work is marketing. And so when you hear about conversion funnels in the marketing world, you're saying we want to go from somebody doing a Google search to clicking on our ad, to landing on our website, to reading about our product, to ultimately purchasing it. And so each one of those is a conversion. And when you're building a conversion funnel in the marketing world, you use all your data and optimization tactics and techniques to increase conversions. You want as many people as possible to make it through every step. When you're building a hiring funnel, you actually want to actively decrease conversions. So everything you can do to cut down on the number of people who make it through each step of that hiring funnel, or what we think of as a negative conversion funnel, because you're trying to get down as quickly as possible to the most qualified people so that you can assess them properly. If we had to assess 60,000 people, we would never be able to do this. But if we can cut that down to a reasonable number, we can actually invest significantly in interviewing those people. So just to give you sort of a sense of what that looks like at Klick, and this is where those teachable moments come in. So we'll do a whole bunch of automated screening as much as we can. Then we'll do screening by our recruiting team, or our talent scouts as we call them. We'll do screening by hiring managers. We'll get down to the point where we're interviewing people. Now, the interviewing is really where this deviates from most hiring practices. And this is all run through Candidate 360, which is part of the SenseOS platform. It's one of our apps. And so Candidate 360 was built for fast-growing organizations that care deeply about their people and their culture, like we are and like our clients are. And it's tailored for a hiring experience that matches that, rather than a very traditional hiring experience that you might see in a more traditional top-down hierarchical sort of organization. So the teachable moments come in a few places in this. One of them is we look at the world of hiring through the concept of dimensions. You think about a given role in an organization. So let's use an example from Klick, just to keep this specific. We're hiring a group account director, let's say. So that's one of the most senior roles in our client service organization. Now, in most cases, especially in larger companies, you'll have something like a competency matrix or a skill tree or something like that for that role. And we don't actually think that's the right way to look at the world. It's a very one-size-fits-all approach, for example. So what we did in creating the dimensions for a group account director, and we do with all of the clients that roll out Candidate 360 in their organizations, was to focus with the existing group account directors on understanding what makes somebody a good group account director at Klick. So not just in general, but specific to our organization. And we came up with a set of dimensions. There's usually 4 or 5 of them for a role. And they tend to focus on what would traditionally be called the softer skills rather than the hard skills. So we wouldn't say what makes a group account director is ability to look at Excel spreadsheets, because we can test for the hard skills. But what makes a group account director here, and my favorite dimension, especially when I'm demoing this, is lovable. Lovable is one of the dimensions that makes a good group account director. And then we defined lovable, so it's got a set of bullets about it, and it's things like lights up a room when they walk into it, or very positive outlook on life. And then when you're doing an interview with somebody, you're asked afterwards to assess them, but not as a numeric score, because what does it mean to be a 3 out of 5 on lovable? It's a very difficult question to answer, right? And actually, when you do that, you just get a lot of 4s, because what happens is people say, well, you weren't the most lovable person that I've ever met, so I can't say 5. But you were more lovable than most people I've met, so I can't say 3, which would be average, so I'm going to make you a 4 out of 5. And so that's what you get. You get a lot of 4 out of 5s. So we borrowed actually a page from Amazon. They have a technique that they call bar raising there. Their question is, does this new person raise the bar on our existing team? So we borrowed that concept, we adapted a little bit. So when you're doing an interview, you are going to assess this person for whatever role they're joining, say a group account director. You're going to assess them on those dimensions that are defined. And the question we're going to ask you afterwards for each of those dimensions is, how do they compare to the existing team? Because everybody is joining an existing team. And if our teams aren't getting at least incrementally better on one of those dimensions for every new hire, the team is either remaining flat or declining over time. So you want to continuously grow the team's capabilities. That means every new hire has to add something that was missing from the team today. So I might say on lovable, for example, if I was interviewing somebody, my options are they transform the team, or they're above the team bar, or they're coachable to reach the team bar, or they're below the team bar. And so that's a much easier question to answer. It's not a numeric score, and I can think about it. I know our group account directors already. Yeah, you know what? I think this person would actually transform the team on this particular dimension. So before I do that interview, usually the day before, but our clients can configure it, I'll get a notification from Sensei, which says, you have an interview coming up tomorrow with Kelly. This is our situational awareness briefing. So how can I tell you everything you need to know to walk into that interview as prepared as possible for it without you having to go look for that information? Because the reality is you won't go look for it until 5 minutes before the interview when you look on your calendar and realize it's coming up, and that's too late, and then you won't be able to find it, and it's too diverse. It's spread out through all kinds of different places. So we send it to you in an email the night before, and that gives you time it might be that evening, it could be on your commute into work the next day, it might be in a break earlier in the day, to just review that email and get all the information that you need. So sometimes, even though we sort of banned email, we still rely on it as a way to push information out to people because it's very effective in that context. So in that briefing, and this is really in and of itself, in a way, a teachable moment because we're teaching you about your upcoming interview. We'll give you a link to the resume and any other supporting information. We'll remind you of the role that they're coming in for. We'll remind you of the dimensions for that role and how they're defined so that you can see that and say, okay, right, group account director, I need to think about things like lovable, got it. We'll actually give you the interview notes for the previous interviews that have been done. And this is a bit of a controversial one. Lots of hiring best practice says you shouldn't do this because you're going to bias the outcome of the interview. But to us, this is in and of itself is a teachable moment, because what happens if I don't give you that is, even if I've prepared you for the role that you're hiring for, you walk in there with no knowledge of what's already happened with this candidate. That means two things. One, you're going to reduce the candidate experience. The candidate is now going to have, let's say they're interviewed by 5 people, 5 first interviews, and they're almost all the same interview. So the candidate experience is repeating themselves 5 times. That also means the other part of this, the second part, from Klick's perspective or the organization's perspective, we didn't learn anything new in those 5 interviews. We just learned the same set of things basically 5 times over. But also, every good candidate, and to get to this point in our hiring process, you got to be a pretty good candidate because you made it through a ton of screening, has rehearsed and knows the answers to the questions you're going to ask in that first interview. So they're giving you their best possible answer, and you're just hearing it 5 times over, and then you're making a hiring decision. If you share those interview notes, then you get off of that. So if I'm the first interviewer of Kelly and I ask you a question about, sort of typical interview question, Kelly, tell me about a time where you had to take charge of a situation that wasn't going well and how you turned it around. And you know the answer to that question because you've practiced it and you've rehearsed it. And so you give me your rehearsed answer and I say, okay, great, that seems like a good answer. And then I put it in the interview notes. And then the next person to interview you gets briefed in advance, gets that question, and sees your answer, and then asks you the question, and you start into your well-rehearsed story about that time where you did that thing, and they stop you and say, actually, you know what, Kelly, sorry, I'm going to stop you there. You told that story to Jay. Tell me a different story. And now you're pushed off of your prepared interview script, and this is now you off the cuff, which is what we really want. And so it's so much more powerful to be able to do that. So you get that. But the real teachable moment here, even though I would consider all the rest of them teachable moments as well, is we know your interview history. So we'll look to see if you have interviewed for a GAD role ever in the past or recently in the past. And if you haven't, we will enroll you automatically in Academy into a very lightweight, very short video learning opportunity with the head of the client service department who will teach you how to interview GADs. So you will now get this training intervention. It's very short. It might be a few minutes long at the outside. And you're enrolled automatically. And there'll be a link in that email that takes you straight to that training piece. And it'll take you a few minutes to watch it. And it'll be the head of client service who will say, okay, so you're interviewing a GAD. Here's the things I look for. Here's some questions you might consider asking. Here's watch-outs that you should think about. And that gets you so much more prepared for that interview in such a short period of time. But we don't enroll you every time, which is what a traditional enterprise software system would do. And then you're just annoyed and you skip over it. We only enroll you if you haven't done it in a while or it's your first time. And that's really at its heart sort of the essence of a teachable moment. We'll do the same thing with that new hire when they start. Depending on their background and their history, what role they're joining, their level of seniority, all kinds of factors, they will get enrolled automatically into an onboarding training program that's adapted specifically to the things that they've done in the past. And they might have a few weeks to get through that content. If they are, in our case, for example, if they're new to the life science industry, they'll get enrolled directly into a regulatory program that teaches them about sort of what we need to look out for from a regulatory perspective. If this is the first time, say, for example, at Klick, that you go from being a different role to being a project manager, we know that. We know your entire work history. We know what you've done in the past. And so you will get enrolled into a Welcome to the PMO course for existing Klicksters that doesn't teach you the basics of being of sort of Klick's view of the world, because you already know that. It just teaches you the difference between being whatever you were before and being a project manager. That's a teachable moment that we can intervene with and we can provide you with that content.
So do you guys build all that logic into the system? And I guess it feels overwhelming if you were, especially for your Sensei clients, pulling all that together.
Absolutely. And it can be overwhelming. The system is actually built to accommodate all of that. So all of the infrastructure to be able to tailor those business rules is built into the system already, and it's really just a configuration question. Most of our clients don't configure all of this out of the box. It's so much, and it needs some time to breathe. It needs to learn about the organization and start recording data before we can start to make some of those really data-driven decisions. So Klick has the advantage of 17 years of data in the system. Obviously, our clients don't. So out of the box, it comes with really smart default configurations that do a bunch of the stuff on its own. And then over time, as the system starts to build data up, the customer success coach that's working with that particular client will help them with the configuration of these things. And often clients very quickly adapt to sort of the new world view of looking at this and come back with these questions themselves. And how could we better use it here? Or how could we adapt it to this thing? So whether it's something like that hiring flow that we just talked about, or whether it's something like using the notification system as we do at Klick to be triggered to provide, this is more out of the decoded principles. So we've talked a little bit, that's really sort of tech as a coach, the idea of these teachable moments where your technology goes from being an angry referee that's yelling at your people for violating business rules to this coach in their corner whispering in their ears. So that's sort of the tech as a coach piece. We start to get a little bit more into what we call data as a sixth sense. So how do you arm your people with the right data at the right time to make better decisions faster? And so one of the very configurable pieces of the platform is our notification system, because it can say, oh, this thing is coming up. And so in order to prepare Kelly for this thing, here's the data that she needs for it. So that notification in the hiring flow that says you have an interview coming up, here's everything you need to know, that's part of that data as a sixth sense. We do this even, for example, integrated into travel. So when the system knows that somebody's traveling to visit one of our clients, it will prepare what we call in-flight reading. In-flight reading is designed to be read on a smartphone. It gets delivered to you an hour before your flight takes off because the system knows about your flight time. And it's a curated view of full situational awareness of the client that you're going to visit. So highly adapted to our business, but our clients have done exactly the same thing for pieces of their business. Oh, you have a meeting coming up with this client. Here's everything you need to know about the current state of the account, about overdue payments, about work that we're doing, projects that are underway, how the team is feeling about those projects, all put into a single email for you without interrupting another person in the organization, delivered to you at exactly the right time so that you can make maximal use of it. So highly customized for the right clients who need that capability, but transformative to the way that they deliver their services to their clients once it's in place. And really, I think part of the power of it is you can do that today, but you would typically send an email, CC'd to everybody on your team. You'd say, hey guys, I'm going to visit client X on Thursday afternoon. What do I need to know? And then the team goes into this mad scramble to figure out the answer to that question. And then they contact all the people on their teams and they try to pull this stuff together. And you get a very incomplete view, which is half in PowerPoint decks, half in Excel documents, a link to a SharePoint drive, whatever it is. And it's now dumped on you. And you have to try to figure out if the stuff even answered your question. And so in the case of something like this, when I go visit a client, I do none of that. The system just sends me an email an hour before my flight takes off, or if in the case of a meeting that I don't have to fly to, usually a few hours before that meeting, and I just read through the email and I am fully aware of everything that's going on with that client before I even set foot in the door. So data as a sixth sense, very customizable, but not something that you have to set up right out of the box, and something that you can grow into as the system starts to learn about your business and have that data in.
Yeah, I thought that was a fabulous example from the book. And having been a member of a large organizations before, you always get that conversation of, don't you people talk to each other? Right. So I could see where that would be a huge advantage to a company.
Hi, it's Kelly again. Great interview. Am I right? Am I right? Yes, part 2 is coming soon. Be sure and listen to it too.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com. Or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.